and does something and it pisses people off and they stop giving PETA money. That would be an example of a negative rad link effect. So that would be the ALF goes out and does something, we all learn a lot about what's happening to animals, and there's a vegan revolution, right? That would be the best case scenario for a positive radical flank effect. So for me, a really important question is, what's the radical flank effect in the animal rights movement? There's almost no scholarship. Haynes did this neat study on the civil rights movement. He found that there's a positive radical flank effect. People go out and bomb stuff and get scary, and then mainstream organizations make a lot of money. This is what he finds, surprisingly, even though it's super cool, no one else has really studied it. So as a social movement scholar, that's why I'm interested in it. And then as someone who's involved in the movement, I'm super interested because there's these really big debates in the animal rights movement about whether or not militant direct action is good or bad for the movement. So that's the part that I want to focus on today. So what I'm going to do today is introduce you all to the debates if you're not already aware of them. And if I forget something, leave something out, feel free to yell at me, interject, that's fine. And then I would like to actually look empirically, look at some data, and try to figure out what's actually going on. Is there any validity to any of these claims? Best and Ocella kind of disseminate the arguments against militant. I'm switching between militant and radical direct action. I hope that's not confusing you. MDA stands for militant direct action. Best and Ocella say that arguments against militant direct action are either principled, meaning they're ethical, or they're pragmatic, meaning they're practical. They're saying, you know, it's just not working. And I think you can also categorize arguments for radical direct action in the same way. So I want to go through these a little bit. So, let's see, where should we start? So there's the principled argument against it. Militant direct action violates the ethics of animal rights. We have a nonviolent movement. We have a movement where we want to have moral superiority. Going out and scaring people violates the ethics. Did I misquote you, Marty? It's always scary when someone's in the audience that you cite.
I didn't know I was in there.
You are. Hey. The principled argument for is that it's the best way to save animals' lives. The idea is that the welfare model, the smaller cages versus empty cages model, in the end will never lead to total animal liberation, so you shouldn't engage in that, and the best way not to engage in that is direct action. And there's also the idea that animals need help now. You have to go to the animals now. Animals are being hurt now. You can't wait. So that's the ethical argument for. There's also pragmatic arguments for and against it, and these are basically the radical flank effect that we just talked about. So the argument against it that's practical is that it brings negative attention and it invites repression. So a lot of people say the AATA happened because these militant direct actions picked up, right? Then the positive radical flank effect is the idea that you get an open space to discuss the topic. If something happens, then people are going to talk about it, and then you can slip in your animal rights message right there, right? And so there's a really huge debate about this, but actually there's no data, really, that I've seen to really back up any of these debates. So in my research, I'm kind of taking a first stab at that. I haven't really succeeded yet. I think it'll be a project that will always go on because, as we know, social movements change throughout time. So the idea that militant direct action violates an animal rights ethic is most clearly emphasized through the notion that there's a hierarchy of militant direct action. So when I talk to activists, I got this idea that direct action probably isn't good. Militant direct action is bad. And when I say I talk to activists, I mean the ones that feel this way. And you can see how their opinions kind of work around this because there's a hierarchy of which direct actions are good and which ones are bad. And this sentiment is best expressed by Paul Shapiro, who's currently the senior director of a factory farming campaign at the Humane Society. And he started an organization called Compassion Over Killing. And he took a strong stance against some direct action while embracing others. So I asked him about why the Humane Society offered more money for information regarding the identities of some activists accused of engaging in some direct action. And his response, I didn't bring up bombings or violence or anything, but that was his immediate response. Bombings have no place in the animal protection movement. They're so detrimental to the cause of animal protection that the movement needs to take a stance against them. Those are the tactics that enable laws like the AATA to get passed. So here we see that the idea of violence is bad, and the idea that this invites repression is present. He highlights that certain kinds of direct action are okay. The Martin Luther Kings of our country and the Gandhis of the world that use those types of tactics under very specific parameters of nonviolent civil disobedience. What we're talking about are cases where people are actually harmed or threatened with harm that are so detrimental to the animal rights movement. So here's making that distinction between direct action and militant direct action. So some direct action is good, militant direct action that's seen as violent or illegal is bad. I should explain a little bit about how I get this information and these numbers. If you've been here throughout the week, you've heard Peter Young speak a couple times, and he talked about the diary of actions that he compiled. He compiled the most extensive list we know of to date of all the illegal direct actions that have occurred since, I think, 1978. And I'm going to actually look at the trends. I'm going to look at percentages and averages and numbers so that we can see what's actually going on. So I want to begin by looking at the foundations of the principled claims. The main argument here against militant direct action is whether these actions are violent. So there's the idea that violence betrays the movement. Scaring people betrays the movement. The argument in support is that animals' lives are saved. If we look at all the actions that happened between 1995 and 2000, we see, oh, sorry, I am way ahead of myself. We will come back to those, don't worry. Okay. This is the percentage of actions, right? We see that almost, now we're going to debate over what's violence later. You guys are going to define that for me. I'm not going to define it for you, but things that are called violence are things like going to someone's personal residence and doing something, a bomb threat, an arson. And we see that almost never happens. I mean, there are about 300 actions happening in this period of time. So 2 bomb threats, that's not a lot, right? Almost no arsons, hardly ever showing up in the middle of the night and scaring people. But there's also not that many animal liberations, right? So there's a lot of debate about actions that aren't really happening very much. Almost everything is throwing rocks through the window at McDonald's, or spray painting on a wall, or gluing a lock. That's almost everything that's happening. So it seems to me that neither of the claims is wholly supported by what's actually happening. And here I'm even accepting the most conservative definition of what you could call violence, and I'm still not seeing support for that. There's no doubt that these liberations meant everything into the world to those animals that were liberated, but when we look at all the actions that are happening, very few of them are actually liberating animals. I got excited. I'm going to backtrack. I thought you guys might actually want to see how often these things happen. So these are just a number of militant direct actions that we know of that happened between 1995 and 2000. So, you know, there's a spike in the mid to late 1990s. Those are mostly vandalism. And as we get in the 2000s, after 2000, we're going to see them drop off because people have less of a tendency to report them. And who are people targeting? Can you guys read this okay? So these are the different industries, percent of total that's being targeted. So mostly it's fur and food, and by food I mean restaurant. Farm is like confined farming operations. And that's because these are kind of easy targets in the sense that you can release mink. This is what I think. You can release mink into the wild. You don't have to rehome mink. So that makes it a little bit easier. And you can throw a brick through a window pretty easily. And a lot of these are fur stores too, not just fur farms, but fur stores.